Hi everyone, I'm Jane at Rockin' Worms. Hope you're having a good evening. What I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is how I set up a brand new breeder bin right from scratch. And it's going to be a step-by-step process that I'm going to show you. So this video might be a little bit longer than my normal ones, but I think you'll find it helpful and very instructive in how to go through the process. Additionally, I will also be sharing some tips and tricks on how to maximize breeding in your bin if you don't want or need a breeder bin, but would still like to, get some additional cocoons out of your adult worms. So let's get started. I'm going to show you the worms that we're going to be putting into the breeder bin, because one of the first considerations you need to set up a new breeder bin, any worm bin as well, is how many worms are you going to be putting into your bin, because that will dictate to a large extent what size bin you want to use. Okay, so here are some of the breeders. I picked these out last night, and we're going to, make them a new home, all right? They're in my bedding mix already because, like I said, I did this last night. My cameraman was doing his Sleeping Beauty routine, so I wasn't able to, film and put the red wigglers into their new home right away, so I needed some place for them to hang out for the day, all right? So I did not count these worms when I pulled them out of one of my grow out bins, but I'm guessing I have about 250 to 300 worms in here. I will count them at some point, probably on the next breed cycle, just so I know how many I have, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. So with about 250, 300 worms, I'm looking to use a bin that is more or less this size. The general calculation is 200 worms per square foot of surface area, or 100 worms per gallon of bedding. However, it is very standard that in a breeder bin that you maximize the number of worms per square foot as much as you're comfortable with, because you want to maximize the opportunities for the worms to meet and greet and therefore mate and make cocoons. So with this amount of worms, I would normally be looking at this size bin, but for me, I am going to be adding worms. I'm going to start putting this bedding in, and I'll talk to you about it in a minute. I'm going to be adding more breeders into this bin over the next couple of weeks anyways, as I go through some of my other grow out bins and pull out more breeders to go into this bin. So I want this bin to be larger than what the worms I currently have dictate, so I can expand this and, be good to go. So what I'm pouring in right now is my bedding mix, which comprises of my indoor tabletop compost, pre-compost, mixed with sifted cow manure. And I generally do about equal parts of each of the ingredients. But honestly, it doesn't really matter in this kind of situation, because both the pre-compost and the cow manure are both very good for the worms. Now, I want to show you briefly, this is what the separate ingredients look like. This is the indoor tabletop pre-composted bedding that's been going. This is from my outdoor bin of it on my patio. This stuff has been going for about 3 or 4 months. So it's really quite broken down. You can still see there's some little bits and pieces in it, but there's a ton of biota in here. It's broken down most of the cardboard shred. I'm going to dump that in and I'll just mix it. Why not? And then this is the sifted cow manure. It is literally out of my cow pasture, and it has bits of grass. It has biota in it, and it's a great substrate for the worms. In fact, another name for compost worms, especially red wigglers, are manure worms. They are found naturally in manures, horse, cow, in particular. I assume sheep, but I don't know that. But anyway, since they're called manure worms, they certainly can exist in manure. Now, what I did is I did add quite a bit of water into this bedding to mix it up, because as you saw, that cow manure is super dry and it needed to be rehydrated. The compost, the pre-compost is damp, but certainly not wet, and wasn't wet enough to rehydrate the cow manure. So I did have to add quite a bit of water. Okay, so one of the things when you're doing a breeder bin is you want the bedding to be quite moist. And if I squeeze it, you can hear the moisture in there. You can see the moisture on my gloves. You can see that it's really holding together. And if I tap it, it's starting to break loose. But, I do have to put some pressure on it. I'm not, grinding it, but I am putting pressure on it. So this is the type of moisture level you want for your breeder bins. Okay, definitely on the moisture side, and keep that level up. Now, it's the same idea if you're doing breeders in your regular bin and you want to increase the breeding. Make your bedding a little bit more moist than you perhaps would normally make it. And again, it will just facilitate the worms being able to move through the mixture, meet and greet, and make those cocoons. Okay, so this is the bedding that I have. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to start adding in some worm chow food and some of the amendments into the bedding directly, because I want this food to be distributed throughout my breeder bin. That way, the worms don't have to travel to eat. They can just eat where they are. And because I'm increasing the population of the breeders over time, there's going to be plenty of breeders all, eating next to each other, and the feeding will, allow them to concentrate more on breeding than on finding food. Now, here's the funny thing. Alternatively, if you want to increase breeding in your regular bins, you actually don't necessarily want your food distributed all through your bin. You're going to want to do a concentrated feeding zone, like a feeding trough, where you can put in food that will draw the worms into a central location or a specific location where they can then meet to eat and find a mate. So it's a little funny that one way to do a breeder bin is to put the food all through the bin, and the other way to do a breeder bin is to put the food all in one location so the worms can come in. So they both work very well. You just have to decide what you want to do. And you can always try both ways and see what seems to give you the most cocoons. Now, I just put in worm chow, but if I don't have worm chow or I don't want to use worm chow, I can use regular food in this trough feeding method. And this is just to give you some ideas of foods you can use that worms particularly like and will draw them in very strongly to that center location so the meet, greet, and mating can happen. This is frozen pumpkin. This is a mango seed with a lot of the flesh still on it. This is a frozen banana peel, and this is just the banana. These are just examples. Other foods like apples are particularly attractive to the worms. Now, again, because I put food throughout my bin and that's how I prefer to do my breeder bins, I'm not going to put this food in, but I did want you to see, you know, some examples of what you could use to do that. Okay, now, other amendments I'm going to put in is a little bit of the Dolomite lime, just a little bit. I don't have a lot of foodstuffs in here, so I'm not really trying to pH buffer too much. But I'm also using this as grit because I am out of eggshells. And then the last thing I'm going to add is a little, whoop, that was a clumpy part. So I was going to say a little bit of the azomite. It kind of came out, but that's okay because I'm going to mix it all in. Now, it is nice to add some of your soil amendments like the azomite right directly into your bins where your worms are, because your worms will eat those additives and start processing them. So when the castings, the finished castings, hit your garden, your plants, your trees, the minerals and things in azomite, the calcium, if you're using eggshells, will be much more bioavailable to your plants right away than if you had added them directly to the plants, and then they would need to break down more in order for your plants to be able to access those nutrients. Okay, so just checking the moisture again. You can, yep, I still feel that that's pretty good. All right, so now I'm going to double check. Yep, I'm ready to add the worms. Okay, and here they are. Okay, really nice. Let me just pick out a couple. Little red wiggler, bulgy clitellum, yellow tail, red wiggler, breeder ready to go. And they're all, again, breeders. Look at this one. This one has a really fat, bulgy clitellum. This little guy is really ready to rock and roll some cocoons for me. All right, let me put this in. One thing I want to mention, because I don't think this gets said enough, and sometimes people are like, what's happening? Why is this happening? Is, let me talk about the food for a minute. If you normally trench feed, your worms, you know, are used to the food being down lower into the bedding, right? Because that's, you've basically habituated them to come in to the food and have it down lower, and they're coming in, you know, sideways, all right? If you normally do a top feeding, your worms are used to finding food on the top of the soil, and that's where they're gonna go to look to find their next meal. So when you're trying to increase or maximize your cocoon production, you want to put your food, whether again it's worm chow or vegetables, you want to put it in the place that the worms are used to finding the food. Okay, so I've actually had this happen to me, where I have gone into my breeder bins to check on them and felt that they needed an additional feeding. And I put worm chow on the top and then, you know, sprayed it down a little bit. And then I went back like, you know, 2 days later, 3 days later, and they hadn't touched it at all. And I was like, it's the same worm chow they always get. It was literally the same batch of worm chow. What's going on? And then the light bulb went off and I was like, oh, they're not used to finding food on the top of the bedding, so they don't even kind of sort of know that it's there right away. It takes them time to find it. So all I'm saying is, when you want to increase your breeding and you want to bring your worms in to a central location, if you normally top feed, do your feeding on the top. If you normally bury your food, then continue to bury your food. Just make that food a little bit more of the sweet treats that the worms prefer as a, you know, nice lure to bring them in. Think of it as giving them a candlelight dinner. So they're in the mood and in the right place to do their breeding. All right. So let me see if there was anything else. I think that's basically it. Let me check my notes here for just a moment. Just make sure I talked about number of worms burnt, bin size, bedding, moisture level, feeding choices. Okay, yeah. So we're almost done here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cover my worms up for the next 21 days. That is the normal breeding cycle for breeder bins. It's 21 days. And hey, listen, that doesn't mean that you can't, you know, pull your breeders at 18 days or 17 days. It also doesn't mean that you can't pull your breeders on day 22 or 23. But 21 days is that sweet spot where the cocoons have been laid and very few have hatched yet, because it's a lot easier to pull your breeders out and set up your cocoon bins if you don't have a lot of baby worms, you know, wiggling around. All right. So, you know what? I'm going to give this just a little bit of a spritz. It basically helps the newspaper stay down. I'm not putting on very much because this bedding is already, you know, the optimal moisture level that I'd like it to be. So this is, again, just some newspaper, and I'm going to put on the piece of plastic. Now, you don't need a newspaper and a plastic covering on a breeder bin. You don't need it on any worm bin. It depends on what your environmental circumstances are. Here in Southeast Florida, it's now already getting into, you know, the high 80s and the low 90s. I have the AC on a lot, and that can dry out my bins very quickly. So by putting the newspaper and a plastic on, I'm just keeping the moisture in. Now, if you're in a different environment and, you know, you don't need to keep the moisture in so much, it's doing it on its own, or you're not running AC or heat as the alternative, you may not need or want a newspaper and a plastic cover, but I do it. All right, so what are the next steps on this? Basically, it's to leave them alone and let them do their job, which is making cocoons, for the next 21 days. And the leave it alone part is, don't disturb them any more than you have to. You know, really try to keep out of the bin if you can. You know, and leaving them alone doesn't mean that you don't go in and check on them. You can certainly peel back the layers and see, you know, the worms on the top, because they'll come up to the top, and it's always, you know, fun and exciting to see them. And you can see like what the status of that newspaper cover is if you are using newspaper cover, because perhaps they're eating it all up and you want to replace that newspaper so the plastic covering isn't, you know, right against the surface of your bedding where it can cut down on the oxygen exchange. Okay, so leaving them alone does not mean ignoring them for 21 days. You can certainly go in and you can peek and check on them. Okay, so that's what it is. If you have any questions or issues or concerns, you do your breeder bins a different way, you know, please make the comments. I'd love to have that type of conversation with you. That's how, again, we learn from each other. I hope this has helped you. And I look forward to hearing about your breeder bin experiences. And also if you have used some of these ideas, tips, tricks, either from me or you already knew them, in your regular bins, and how you feel that impacted cocoon production. All right? So I hope you have a good night. I am yours in the dirt, Jane.